Vince, good morning. Going back about 20 years or more, could you tell us what were some of the reasons for the founding of the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations, and how it all came to be? What was your vision behind this program?
Yeah, the Institute was established in 1998, but I'll go back 3 years behind that to 1995, which was a key year. And prior to 1995, if my country wanted to keep your country's food out, simple, put a tariff or a quota on it. What happened was your country retaliated. The whole world began to decide that this was not the way to do business. So the World Trade Organization was established in 1995. That was significant because now, instead of tariffs and quotas, you had to see if the law was being respected. So that was one of the reasons that prompted us, because of the international reputation of the university, to get involved in that. The second was that some major international and global foundations began to do online courses into developing countries. The concept was great on paper. That was bringing expertise from the developed world into the developing world. What we learned from it was a failure, for the simple reason that they didn't localize the information for the developing country. So the second reason why we got the Institute established was we could set in place very quickly international instructors from all around the world who would then teach online and who would bring the global information into their region of the world.
For example, can you speak to one of those instructors who was part of the program at the outset,
Yes.
and why he or she wanted to participate, felt like it was a program that eventually would become a leader in its field?
Dr. David Jukes at the University of Reading in England had established at that time a website that was on food safety and food law that was very useful. At that time, the United States and Europe had some food safety issues. Now with the World Trade Organization in existence, it was critically important that we have an understanding where the Europeans were coming from, and that the Europeans have an understanding where the United States is coming from. So the teaching of the semester-long course in European food law was taught by Dr. David Jukes, who had all the contacts in the European Union, and he was able to speak directly to some of the major issues.
Very good. Vincent, why is it important for students to learn about food law?
Food law concerns all of us. Over 7 billion people of us in the world are dependent on a safe food supply. So all of us should have a personal interest. But for people coming to university or people related to food, it's critically important that they understand the laws and regulations because of international trade in food, but also understanding countries that have good food laws and regulations in general have a safe food supply. The number of deaths from unsafe food around the world and unsafe water is considerable. And so hopefully an understanding of food laws and regulations makes the food supply safer for all of us.
Very good. Vincent, tell us how courses in the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations have helped some of the students in the past advance their careers within the food industry, both here in the United States and globally.
Yes, globally, a number of people who have taken the certificate through the Institute of Food Laws and Regulations of Michigan State University now have senior government positions in a number of countries because they were among a select few who understood not only the importance of food law in their own developing country, but also the importance of knowing and understanding food laws in countries like the United States, the European Union, etc. So that is one major reason. A second example is I teach the Codex Alimentarius course, which means the Global Food Code. Codex Alimentarius is administered by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. There are 184 countries represented in Codex. In assignments in that course, I take issues that Codex is dealing with, which is of interest to all of us, and the students are asked to give their answer in the context of their country. I got an email at the beginning of the course from a lady who was from Michigan, grew up in Michigan, who was on a USAID assignment in a developing country in Africa. She asked, could she make the Liberia her country? She did. She did a wonderful job on it, and so much so that the Liberians were so impressed that they began to get a better understanding of the importance of Codex for their country. And I was out there a few months after the course finished to do some workshops. All of that resulted in she taking an IFLR course in Codex Alimentarius. One other quick story was I had two students from a major multinational food company taking the course. Their boss had an attitude to online courses that they were fluff, they were easy, they were pushovers, if I can use that expression. When these two students showed what they were getting from an Institute of Food Laws and Regulations course, he was enormously impressed, and the company paid the full course fee. Normally they didn't, because they thought these courses were not valuable. He saw the value of them. And so we've had a number of people from major multinational food companies from around the world take these food law courses online.
How does, taking that a step further, why does food law matter to someone who works solely for a domestic food business?
That's a good question, because the food industry has changed enormously in the last 20 years. And now, one of the first things students are taught in food science is least cost formulation. So that if you can get ingredients at the lowest cost anywhere in the world, then you put them into your food. And so now what is typically happening is that food produced by even a small producer within a country now contains ingredients from many countries around the world. And those ingredients are going to be changing in large part because of a change of cost. And as a consumer, I have a concern knowing that some of these countries where these ingredients are sourced in have either very poor or non-existent food laws and regulations. So the safety of some of those ingredients would come into question.
Very good. In your opinion, Vincent, how does knowledge of food law help companies succeed? Or, on the other hand, a lack of knowledge, how could that perhaps cause the company to fail?
The answer to that is very simple. There is a growing consumer awareness to food safety and the responsibility of food companies. Good food companies develop trust. But if the food company is responsible through their own negligence or ignorance of food laws and regulations, that can lead to major illness among consumers and even death. And it is well documented. There are some well-known companies who have either suffered very severe financial consequences as a result or have gone out of business. And sadly, people have died.
Vincent, why is the food code important now and moving forward in this global food existence that is so, so much a part of our everyday world nowadays?
Codex Alimentarius is important for all 184 countries who are members of Codex. One of the important reasons why it's important is if there's a trade dispute, then and arbitration goes to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, then it is the standards and guidelines of Codex Alimentarius that's used in the World Trade Organization coming to a decision. So it is critically important in terms of trade disputes. It's also very important for developing countries because many of these countries either have no food safety laws at the national level or those laws are pathetically out of date. And so one of the best ways of rapidly bringing a new national food law into existence or updating is to use the information that Codex provides in terms of standards, guidelines, etc. And so from that point of view, it benefits developing countries considerably. Also, Codex has among its membership a large number of NGOs or non-government organizations. Many of these represent large commodity groups at the international level. And so for companies, it is useful for them to work through a non-government organization that represents them in Codex to see that their points of view are brought to attention. And lastly, the Codex website is extremely useful for anybody, consumers, food importers, food processors, etc., because there's a large number of standards and guidelines covering various aspects of food safety. So Codex, suddenly it was a well-kept secret. It was established in 1963. And it really came into significance and prominence in 1995 because of the World Trade Organization. And the US and the European Union and the large developed countries are very well represented at all Codex meetings. For example, Codex has committees on pesticide residues, contaminants in food, food hygiene, food additives, food labeling, veterinary drug residues in food, and the list is long. It is an incredibly useful resource for people to access.
How difficult is it for a developing country to incorporate Codex into their laws and regulations, or to make it a part of their I can't think of the right word. Why would it be important for a developing country to introduce Codex into its?
It's very important for developing countries to be involved in Codex for two reasons. One is they are now the provider of quite a large number of ingredients that goes into our processed foods that are manufactured in the developing countries. Having a knowledge and application of the guidelines and standards of Codex is going to help them greatly. Secondly, many of these countries have no national food laws, or if they do, many of those food laws and regulations are totally out of date. And so Codex is a resource that there is a wealth of useful information that can be downloaded immediately from their website and incorporated into their national laws and regulations. So now, attendance at Codex meetings for some of the less developed countries is difficult because of financial costs. However, Codex, a number of years ago, established a trust fund that pays for the development of personnel within the developing country to attend and participate at Codex meetings. There's also recently been a wonderful new development, and that is now Codex has what they call working groups. That's electronic working groups. And so they're making a good attempt to incorporate some of the lesser developed countries into engaging in electronic working groups on specific issues.
Coming back to the IFLR program, looking ahead to say the next 10 or 20 years, what do you see as the primary role of the program, the future of the program, if you can predict it, and its importance within the global food industry?
Well, I think as of today, over 100 countries have had participants in the various IFLR food law courses. That is even going to grow. As said, there are 184 countries represented in Codex Alimentarius. As these countries grow and develop, this is an effective and economic way of delivering information to them. I see a number of developments that will be very positive for the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations. One of them is that government regulatory agencies, irrespective of the country, deal with only the regulations of their country. The food industry, irrespective of where they're located, their obligation is to meet the laws and regulations so that they can market their food. There is a key role for universities, and that is they can move outside national boundaries, first of all, and look at issues from a global perspective. And that is what I think one of the major contributions to the success of the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations. It looks at global issues and not just parochial national issues. Secondly, governments and the food industry have certain specific messages to deliver, whereas universities have the obligation to be neutral, to be all-inclusive, to look at issues from all directions, and certainly the laws and regulations lend itself to that. So the provider of global perspectives are not going to come from government agencies per se, or from the food industry. They're going to come specifically from universities. And what is so wonderful about having an online global course is that in the courses I have been involved in, there are at least 10, 11, 12 countries represented in that one course. And when they're given a challenge of looking at a food safety issue that's of global importance, it's fascinating to see that somebody from opposite sides of the world will be equally correct, but they're approaching the issue from different directions for a variety of variables.
Vincent, food laws, the nature of food laws, as you well know, are constantly changing. What role does the university play in bringing its students up to speed and current with what's going on across the world in food law?
The Institute for Food Laws and Regulations plays a very important role in that regard, because all of the courses online are updated right up to date just before the semester starts in which the course is being offered. That is critically important because in all countries, either new issues are coming online for consideration or existing issues are being updated. So for example, when the Institute was established, the laws and regulations concerning genetically modified organisms or biotechnology in relation to human food was a new issue. Now it is 20 years later, we know a lot more, and the regulations in terms of labeling, etc., are being looked at for a second time. A new area that has come into existence recently is antibiotics in food and their use and the regulations of them. Codex deals with that specific issue. And so it is critically important that the participants in a course provided by the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations has the understanding, two understandings that are important. One is the material they're getting is totally up to date, but the obligation on them, if they are to continue successfully applying and utilizing the food law and regulation, the obligation is on them to keep themselves totally up to date. Now, that is easy and inexpensive because the FDA, USDA, EPA, putting it in the American context, have excellent websites. We can access that information immediately. One, to put things in perspective for people who are now so much used to the internet use and it being at our fingertips, when we started this program, even for the United States, I had to walk across campus to come to the library, to go down to the basement where government documents were kept. Government documents were unbound. The very document or pages that I was looking for, sometimes, unfortunately, were torn out. I had to go and find some other source. It was delay, it was inefficient and ineffective. If I wanted information on food laws on any other country, and I'm talking now back in 1998 when we started, I would have to write a letter to the agricultural attaché of that embassy in Washington, D.C. to get the information I wanted. Sometimes I got it, sometimes I didn't. Now move 20 years forward. All of it is at our fingertips for all nations across the world. And so it's always, or it makes it more important for universities to play that important role in pulling all of that information together and then interpreting it correctly. So times have changed for the better.
Yes, yes. Just going to look through. This would, I think we could just make a small or a short clip about, if we could talk about the ingredients in the pizza, and if you could tell that story, not story, but relate that piece of your presentation from about a month or so ago, that just how many different countries can be represented in a common, everyday, ordinary pizza. I really don't have a specific question other than if you could just go into this and just tell the story like you did.
To give a global perspective on the importance of food laws and regulations, we might reduce it to something that most of us around the world nowadays are very familiar with, and that is the pizza. The pizza to most of us now looks very convenient, very common, but the pizza is very complicated in terms of ingredients and in terms of food laws and regulations. The Food Safety Authority of Ireland produced a fascinating illustration of the simple pizza. And what they had as the heading was that kind of, do you realize that the ingredients from this could come from a list of about 60 different countries? So they listed those countries out. Now what's fascinating is that you or I may go in to buy our favorite pizza, same pizza from the same shop today, and we go back 1 month later. Is it the same? Probably not. For one simple reason. Pizza manufacturers, like all food manufacturers, go on the principle of least cost formulation. And so if they find cheaper ingredients in different countries, they will source those. So your pizza is the same from the same supplier with the same list of ingredients, but the countries of origin varies considerably. And that's where I, as somebody probably with a little bit more knowledge than the average consumer, then begins to ponder some of these countries that they're sourcing these ingredients from. either have no national food laws or have food laws that are not up to date or have food laws that are not being applied with proper inspection systems, etc. So there's a classic example that food that we are quite familiar with has got ingredients that are constantly changing and being sourced from around the world.
Vincent, part of the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations requires, or one of the benefits of the program are the number of guest lecturers that will appear throughout a course, throughout a semester, throughout a year. Can you speak to the importance of those guest lecturers and why that distinguishes IFLR from other programs that are attempting to teach food laws and regulations?
Good question. Right from the very beginning, the approach for the Institute for Food Laws and Regulations was global. And so the Asia course is taught by somebody knowledgeable and in Asia. The Latin American course by somebody in Latin America. The European Union food law course by somebody in Europe. The Canadian in Canada. But even break it down a little further, and I'll relate it to the course that I teach, and that's Codex Alimentarius. So for the first 7 modules in that course, the student goes through the workings and the mechanisms involved with Codex Alimentarius. For the remaining 5 lectures, they are modules presented by guest lecturers. And so Codex Alimentarius deals with 2 components: food safety and human health, and the trade in food. And so I got a person from the World Health Organization to give the WHO, World Health Organization, perspective on global food safety and specifically in relation to Codex Alimentarius. Then I got somebody from the World Trade Organization to talk about how Codex is used in trade disputes by the World Trade Organization. Then I got somebody from a non-government organization, an NGO, who I knew and was aware of attending many, many Codex meetings to give the food industry perspective. And then it was very important to get the perspective from somebody who worked and was currently living in a developing country. So that module, we got somebody from North Africa and somebody from Southeast Asia to do that model. And finally, the last module was given by somebody from the World Bank, because the World Bank has been very engaged in this. This was a wonderful opportunity to provide unique perspectives that I as an instructor, and I think any other instructor, individually could not give. The fact that these are in modules coming directly from the experts involved in those areas adds considerably. So by the end of the course, the student not only gets the appropriate important information on the workings of Codex Alimentarius, but now they've had 5 international experts from different parts of the world viewing and telling the students how Codex is applied within their area of expertise. That is something that the Institute has done from the very beginning, and I think is still unique in terms of university offerings.
Excellent. Let's wrap it up by going back to the beginning. How did you?
I thought these were true and false questions.
How did you become interested in food laws and regulations? And how did you become so involved on a global on the global front, if you will? How did it? Can you? Obviously, you've had many travels and experiences, but why food laws for Vincent Hegarty?
I go back to 1995, and I was changing positions from an administrative position in the university. I had to try and look to see what was new, what was unique. And what became readily apparent was, because of 1995 and the World Trade Organization, suddenly food laws were moving from a documentation produced by a government regulatory agency that industry used, and basically where you must do this and you must not do that if you want safe food. That was changing to a much, much more intense investigation into the science, especially behind food laws and regulations. And then, because our food supply was becoming truly global, it was a wonderful opportunity. And then, because of the opening up of availing of expertise from around the world because of the internet connections, this was a wonderful opportunity. I always have been an internationalist. I was educated in Europe and worked all my life in the United States and have traveled the world. And the more I traveled the world, the more I saw, for example, just one example, I have done a lot of work with the U.S. Agency for International Development in Egypt. Now, it was interesting. Food safety in Egypt is a major public health issue. But interesting, what was really of concern to the Egyptians also was the very negative impact of unsafe food on their very, very significant tourist industry. You did not want the tourists coming from halfway around the world to see the pyramids and the ancient monuments in Egypt, and the first day of their vacation they consume unsafe food, and the rest of the time they're seriously ill. So here was an example for one country where safe food was critically important to their tourist industry, and to achieve that, they have now gone through a very significant positive process of improving their food laws and regulations with respect to food safety.
Excellent.
Very good.